The wind carried a strange kind of silence through the hills that day, the kind that hums between the trees, where even the birds hesitate to sing. It was early autumn, and the sky hung heavy with clouds, their gray shadows sliding across the golden slopes like restless ghosts. He stumbled through the brush, one hand pressed against his ribs, the other clutching the strap of his torn pack. His uniform was in tatters, blood dried into the fabric, and each step sent a dull ache through his leg. His name was Elias Ward, a soldier who no longer knew what side of the war he stood on. All he knew was that the battle was over, at least for him, and the hills were the only place left to disappear. Elias had been walking for days. The rumble of artillery had faded into the past, replaced by the whisper of wind and the crackle of leaves underfoot. Hunger gnawed at him, and thirst turned his lips dry and cracked. Every now and then he would pause, listening, thinking he heard voices, or the sound of a stream, but it was always just the wind. Until he saw the smoke. Thin, pale threads rising between the trees. Not the black smoke of war, but soft, bluish-gray, like from a hearth. Hope stirred faintly in his chest. Civilization, shelter, maybe food. He followed it. The path wound upward, narrowing into a trail that looked like no one had used it in years. Wildflowers grew thick around the stones, and moss crawled up the trunks of twisted oaks. By the time he reached the ridge, the smoke had vanished into the low fog, but he smelled it now, wood burning, faint and clean. Then he saw it, a small cottage, half hidden in ivy, perched at the edge of a clearing. The roof sagged under years of rain, and the windows glowed faintly with the color of firelight. Chickens clucked softly in the distance. And beside the doorway, kneeling with a basket of herbs in her lap, was a woman. She looked up when he stepped into view. Her eyes were the first thing he noticed, large, startled, the pale gray of a morning storm. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of the basket. Elias raised a shaking hand. "Please," he rasped. "I mean no harm." She didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. He took one step closer, and swayed. The world tilted. The pain in his side flared like a blade twisting between his ribs. He tried to steady himself, but darkness crowded his vision, and before he could take another breath, the ground rushed up to meet him. The last thing he saw was her face leaning over him, those gray eyes wide, a shadow of fear mixed with something else he couldn't name. Dash dash dash. When he woke, it was to the sound of wind against the window. The room was dim, filled with the faint smell of dried herbs and wood smoke. For a moment, Elias couldn't remember where he was. Then he tried to move, and pain reminded him. His side had been bandaged, his wounds cleaned. Someone had taken off his uniform and wrapped him in a rough wool blanket. He turned his head. She was there, sitting near the fire, mending a tear in a worn dress. Her dark hair was braided loosely down her back, and in the flickering light, her face looked calm, almost distant. "You," his voice came out hoarse. "You helped me." She looked up, met his gaze, and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he murmured. "I don't know how to repay." She lifted a hand, a quiet gesture to stop him, and shook her head gently. Then she pointed to her throat and shook her head again. He frowned. "You can't." He paused, understanding dawning. "You can't speak." Her eyes softened. She nodded once. He sank back into the bed, silent for a long while, watching the fire flicker. The only sound was the soft crackle of burning wood, and the occasional sigh of wind through the cracks in the walls. She moved quietly, like a shadow, tending to the pot above the fire. Steam rose, carrying the scent of herbs and something warm, soup, maybe. She ladled it into a bowl and brought it to him. When he tried to sit up, she placed a steady hand behind his back to help. Her touch was light, careful, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. "Thank you," he whispered again. She smiled faintly, a small, fleeting curve of her lips, then sat back down near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Dash dash dash. Days passed. Elias healed slowly. The wound in his side was deep, but she changed the bandages daily, her hands steady and sure. He learned to read her gestures, the way she tilted her head when asking if he needed water, the soft smile when she was pleased he'd eaten something, the sharp frown when he tried to stand too soon. He tried speaking to her, even though she couldn't reply. It filled the silence, and sometimes, when he talked, she would glance up from her work and listen, truly listen, as if every word mattered. I used to think silence was unbearable, he told her one evening. Back in the trenches, it was the waiting that got you, the quiet before the shells. I thought silence meant death. He paused, staring into the fire. But here, it feels different. She looked at him for a long time, then reached out and placed a single finger against his lips. He fell silent. Her eyes said the rest, that not all silence was empty. Some held meaning deeper than words. He learned her name a week later. There was a book lying on the table, a weathered journal, its pages filled with pressed flowers and small, delicate sketches. When he picked it up, she crossed the room and pointed to the first page, where her name was written in soft, looping letters. Mira. It suited her. Gentle, luminous. He smiled. Mira, he said aloud, tasting the sound. It's beautiful. She blushed, just barely, and turned away. After that, something subtle changed between them. He began to help her when he could, chopping wood when his strength returned, fetching water from the stream, fixing the hinges on the old door. She taught him small things without words, how to brew tea from wild herbs, how to listen to the forest, how to move quietly so the deer would not flee. The hills seemed alive under her care. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers, soft, secret conversations that only she could understand. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, she would stand on the edge of the clearing, close her eyes, and lift her face to the wind. The air would move through her hair, and for a moment, she looked like part of the hills themselves, something ancient and enduring. Elias began to wonder who she had been before, why she lived here alone, and what had taken her voice. One evening, a storm rolled in from the valley, dark clouds swelling over the hills, thunder echoing like distant drums. The wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows. Mira hurried to close the shutters while Elias secured the door. When lightning split the sky, he saw fear flash across her face, not just of the storm, but of something deeper. Hey, he said softly, moving closer. It's just thunder. It'll pass. She shook her head quickly, pressing her hands to her ears. Her whole body trembled. He caught her hands gently, lowering them. Look at me, he said. For a moment, she wouldn't. Then she did, and in her eyes, he saw a story without words. Explosions, fire, screams. He understood. The thunder was a memory, one that sounded too much like war. Without thinking, he drew her close. She stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, her breath shuddering against his chest. It's all right, he whispered. You're safe, I promise. They stayed like that for a long time, the storm raging around them. The thunder rolled, but it was softer now, distant, swallowed by the sound of the rain. When the storm finally faded, Mira pulled back slightly and looked up at him. Her fingers brushed his cheek, a feather-light touch, and then she smiled, small and sad and full of something he couldn't name. Elias realized then that he didn't want to leave the hills. Not yet, maybe not ever. The next morning, the world smelled clean and new. Mist clung to the grass, and the sky had cleared into a soft, golden blue. Mira was outside, hanging damp clothes on a line. Elias watched her from the doorway, sunlight catching the curve of her hair. She turned, saw him watching, and gave a faint smile. He stepped forward, the words on his tongue before he could stop them. I think I was meant to find you. She tilted her head, curious. He smiled faintly. Maybe that sounds foolish, but I was lost, Mira. Not just in those woods, in myself. And somehow, here, with you, I feel like I can breathe again. Her expression softened. She didn't speak, of course, but she reached out and took his hand, pressing it gently against her heart. He felt it, the steady rhythm, warm and alive beneath his palm. The hills around them were quiet, the wind whispering through the trees. And for the first time in years, Elias Ward understood the language of silence. The days settled into a rhythm, slow and steady, much like the river that wound its way down the hills. Elias rose with the sun, fetching water and tending to the small garden Mira had cultivated. In return, she taught him to recognize the edible herbs that grew wild in the underbrush, how to stir soup without spilling, how to listen for the deer so as not to startle them. They rarely spoke, not in words, anyway. The language they shared was softer, subtler, a world of gestures, glances, and gentle touches. Elias found that he learned more from the way Mira moved than he ever had from lectures or orders in the army. The way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head when listening, the soft pressure of her hand on his arm when she wanted to guide him, these were the conversations that mattered most. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the western ridge, painting the hills in shades of copper and rose, Elias found Mira sitting on the old stone wall at the edge of the clearing. She held a small bundle in her lap, a carefully wrapped package of herbs, feathers, and pressed flowers. He approached quietly. "Good evening," he said softly, testing the words on his tongue. She looked up and smiled, a slight nod acknowledging him. She reached into the bundle and pulled out a small, delicate feather. Holding it out toward him, she tapped it gently against his chest, then traced a line down his arm. He understood immediately. Patience, care, gentleness. He smiled in return, and in that smile was gratitude, admiration, and a feeling he had not dared to name. Over the following weeks, Elias grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. The hills, once desolate and lonely, became alive with their shared presence. Birds returned to the trees, rabbits emerged from their burrows, and the air itself seemed warmer, safer. Yet the shadows of the past were never far. At night, when the wind whispered through the eaves, Elias would lie awake listening to the memory of explosions, the echo of distant screams. Mira would sit by the fire, sometimes tracing her fingers over the journal's pages, and Elias would see the flicker of pain in her eyes. He had learned to speak softly to her then, not with words, but with actions. He would brush her hair back from her face when she shivered, hold the door open when the wind blew cold, hum quietly when the night seemed too silent. And she, in turn, began to respond, her smiles longer, her hands more confident in reaching for his, her eyes more luminous when she looked at him. It was during one such evening, as the sky faded into a velvet purple, that Elias noticed something he had not before. Myra's gaze often lingered on the distant hills, her eyes searching, almost as if she were waiting for someone who would never return. "Who were you waiting for?" he asked one night, breaking the usual silence. Mira startled slightly, her hand freezing over the embroidery she was working on. Then she slowly reached into the journal and turned a page. On it was a sketch of a young man, his face delicate and earnest, drawn with a care that suggested longing. Her eyes met his, gray and haunted. She shook her head, gently, as if to say, "He is gone." Elias reached for her hand. "I know what it's like to lose someone," he said softly. "I've lost so many, but you're here now. And we have this." She blinked, a tear catching the last rays of the sun, and finally allowed a faint smile to break through the sadness. The first snow of winter arrived quietly, settling over the hills in a soft blanket of white. Elias and Mira worked together to prepare for the cold, stacking firewood, reinforcing the windows, and harvesting the last of the root vegetables. One morning, as the frost clung to the grass like crystals, Elias found Mira outside, her hands buried in the snow, shaping small figures. Snow rabbits, snow birds, tiny representations of the wildlife that surrounded them. He knelt beside her. "You've been busy," he said with a grin. She glanced up, eyebrows raised, and then laughed, a sound so rare that Elias froze, listening. It was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, fleeting but unforgettable. "You know," he said, "I don't think anyone has ever laughed like that in the hills before." She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with amusement, and tapped him gently with a snow-covered hand. From that day on, their days became a blend of laughter and quiet moments. Elias began to speak more openly, telling Mira stories from the army, tales of distant lands, and the things he had once believed impossible. Mira listened with rapt attention, responding in gestures, sketches, and subtle touches that made Elias's heart ache in the most exquisite way. As winter deepened, the harsh winds and frozen nights tested them both. One evening, after a particularly heavy snowfall, a knock sounded at the door. Elias opened it cautiously, and a traveler stood there, shivering and exhausted. "Please," the man said. "I need shelter, food, anything you can give." Elias glanced at Mira. She nodded faintly, moving to fetch blankets and warm tea. The stranger entered, and Elias helped him settle by the fire. As they shared the small meal, the man spoke of the villages below the hills, of the war that still raged in distant lands, and of people who had suffered much. Elias listened silently, but Mira's eyes remained on him, gray and thoughtful. When the traveler finally left, promising to repay their kindness when he could, Elias turned to Mira. Why do you do this? He asked. She lifted her hands, then pressed them against his chest, then to her own heart, the gesture simple, yet filled with meaning. Compassion, care, love for those who could not protect themselves. Elias felt a warmth spread through him. She was speaking without words, yet he understood every nuance. The turning point came with the thaw of early spring. The snow melted, revealing the first wildflowers poking through the frozen earth. Elias decided it was time to venture down to the village for supplies, and perhaps, if he could, to bring news of the world outside to Mira. She watched him prepare quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her gesture was firm, yet gentle, a silent warning, a plea for caution. Elias nodded. I'll be careful, he promised. The journey down the hill was harder than he anticipated. Mud clung to his boots, and the thawing streams roared over rocks. But with each step, he felt Myra's presence with him, the memory of her hand over his guiding him, protecting him in a way he could not explain. When he reached the village, he found the market bustling with life. People shouted, animals scrambled, and the scent of baked bread and smoke filled the air. Elias wandered through the stalls, buying what they needed: flour, dried fruit, candles, and sugar. He even found a small notebook, blank and waiting, perhaps another journal for Mira to sketch in. As he made his way back to the hills, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the path. He felt a stirring in his chest, anticipation, hope, and something deeper, more intimate. He was not just returning with supplies. He was returning to Mira, to the hills, to a life that had become more real and precious than anything he had known before. He returned to the cottage to find Mira waiting at the edge of the clearing. The light of the setting sun caught her hair, turning it to liquid gold. She stepped forward, silent but radiant, her eyes holding something that made Elias's breath catch. Without words, he handed her the notebook, and she understood. She traced her fingers over the blank pages, then looked up at him, eyes wide with emotion. He reached for her hands. I can't say it enough, he whispered. You saved me, Mira. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever: hope, peace, and love. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, and then pressed a hand to his cheek. Her other hand reached to her throat, a gentle shake of her head. Words were not hers to give, yet her message was clear: I love you too. Elias leaned closer, and for the first time, they bridged the silence that had always separated them. Their lips met, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty, a kiss that carried all the unspoken words of weeks and months. The hills held their secret, the wind swirling around them like a blessing. For the first time, the whispering of the trees was not just background, it was a chorus, celebrating a love that had grown in silence, nurtured by patience and trust. Spring bloomed fully, and the hills came alive. Elias and Mira moved together through the days, learning from each other, sharing small adventures, and discovering the quiet joys of life away from the world's chaos. The past was never far, but it was softened, held at bay by the warmth they had found in each other. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Elias would hear the whispers of the hills, carrying secrets of the past, promises of the future, and the language of love that needed no words. Mira would stand beside him, her hand in his, her eyes reflecting the endless sky, and together they would smile. Because in the hills, amidst silence, snow, and storm, they had found something eternal. Something worth fighting for, something that could not be broken.